So we're going to get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Hi. It is really hard to see everyone, so I appreciate you all moving down to make this more interactive because there's a light shining on the person, and Kathryn will be having this light, so it's nice to be able to connect with you. So thank you all for participating. My name is Suri Tofignia. I'm one of the co-faculty with Julia Zay of MediaWorks for fall and winter and spring. I'll be stepping out in winter, and Julie Russo will be taking in, and I'll be teaching catastrophes with Zoltan Grossman. But I'd also like to welcome MediaWorks students here, as well as Media Artist Studios students are here, as well as some people from Arts of Urgency, some of our sponsors of this event for this presentation we're going to hear about today. So if MediaWorks, can you kind of like raise your hands if you're from MediaWorks? Right, so this is the year-long foundational program in media. And then Media Artist Studios, can you raise your hand? Right, so these are our advanced students that are doing, they took MediaWorks, coincidentally all of them last year, and now they're doing more advanced work. And Lori Meeker, do you want to raise as the faculty of that program? Then do we have any Arts of Urgency students here? All right, raise them proud. You're taking an awesome program with Ruth Hayes and Alice Nelson. Ruth, where are you at? Right there. Anyone else representing a program or something that isn't? Devin, I can't see you. Hi, Devin. And Devin's one of our community members and teaches in summer. What's the program you teach in summer?
Visual music, 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter direct animation.
Woo, very popular here. 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter direct animation visual music program. Anyone else? I think I saw Eric here. Eric, what are you teaching? Okay, Life with Things program with Julia Hanexius. So thank you. Maybe some of your students are here. So I just wanted to welcome everyone and recognize the land that we're on here at Evergreen, that it's part of the traditional Medicine Creek territory, and that we should honor and recognize the indigenous people who protect this land so that we can be here to study today. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that space, especially since we're talking about ethnography. I think it's appropriate to recognize the protectors of this land here for us so we can learn. And the Evergreen State College, there was some funding that was involved as part of a Mellon grant that we received that our Path of Study, the Moving Image Group, wrote so that we could bring Kathryn Ramey here today, as well as contributions from programs. So we couldn't do this without this kind of support. So I wanted to do just a brief introduction. We're excited because as our theme for MediaWorks this year, we're really looking at ethnography as an approach. And so when we learned that Kathryn Ramey had received this amazing Creative Capital grant, what that is, it's a grant that artists get nominated for. Is that correct? Or did you have to apply? You have to apply, but they basically fund a whole year of your research and work. And so she's part of that right now, and we thought it would be an amazing opportunity to bring her here during this year off from her teaching program to share with students what some professional level work looks like in the experimental and anthropology intersection field. So I'm going to read a little bit from her website, and most of you have done some reading from this topic that she's presenting, Productive Dissonance, as an article that we'll be engaging with later. So Kathryn Ramey is a filmmaker and anthropologist whose work operates at the intersection of experimental film processes and ethnographic research. Her award-winning and strongly personal films are characterized by manipulation of the celluloid, including hand processing, optical printing, and various direct animation techniques. Her scholarly interest is focused on the social history of the avant-garde film community, the anthropology of visual communication, and the intersection between avant-garde and ethnographic film and art practices. She's been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, and has published articles in a variety of reviews and journals, including Visual Anthropology, The Independent, Anthologies of Women's Experimental Cinema, Made to be Seen, and she also has a foundational book called Experimental Filmmaking, Break the Machine, which some of you have been reading for your program, which came out in spring of 2015, right? So I do have it here from our library, so great read. I am the person, and I can share it with my faculty. So in that book, she calls it a thinly veiled experimental ethnography on the contemporary experimental film scene, masquerading as a textbook on experimental film techniques written in the freehand voice of a zine. So it's very exciting to welcome Kathryn Ramey here today, and I can't wait to learn more about her work and scholarship. Thank you, Kathryn.
Hi. So, wow, thank you so much, Suri and Julia and Ruth and Lori and everybody who's brought me here. It's pretty amazing to be here. I don't know if, well, I can just move to the next slide. I'll tell you a little bit about my history. I graduated from this place in 1991. Lori Meeker was the first person who put a Bolex in my hands, and a professor who I believe is retired, but still associated with Evergreen, Sally Cloninger, and Anne Fischel, who is actually sort of still here, although retiring, were the two people who really shepherded me through developing this interest in the intersection between ethnographic methodology and experimental cinema. So one of the things that I think it's important to, sort of get out front, I am sort of institutionally certified sociocultural anthropologist. I did get my PhD in it, but I don't do conventional ethnographic studies at all. I'm an artist who uses ethnographic methods as sort of the generative material and also the engagement practice when I'm making my work. And we can talk a little bit more about what I mean by that as we look at the different pieces that I'm going to share with you today. I think it's also important, I don't know about now, and I don't know about here, but experimental film, or whatever you want to call it, this other practice, can sometimes have a pretty negative connotation. When people talk about it, it's often, derided or thought of as being less significant because it's not commercially viable. Which I think is actually a good thing to break out of that consumer cycle in generating media is actually something I am happy about. But it does require that I, figure out somehow to feed myself besides just being an artist. And so we can actually talk about that too, and different strategies other experimental filmmakers I know have gone to. And we're not all teachers. In fact, my dissertation for my PhD was on the economic strategies and networks of experimental filmmakers, how they survive, how they make work, and how essentially, for the most part, the way that they interact with each other is much more like a gift exchange economic model than anything like a capitalist economic model. And why it's so important to embrace and validate these alternative economic models as real and significant. So that's what my PhD dissertation was on, and if you really want to, I think you can look it up somewhere. But I based my book on those ideas, and instead of just writing in the very staid sort of, scholarly language that I was trained in, I tried to bring it alive and in turn those ideas that I had investigated into practice and make that, something that would go out in the world and, make ideally new groups of people trying to make this sort of experimental media. I often talk about when I describe myself as an artist rather than a filmmaker, even though films are the things that I make, because I find it's easier for people to understand calling oneself an artist. When people talk about filmmaking, they think, again, it's something that should be seen in the multiplex and commercially viable. So the first thing I thought I might do was, see if anybody had kind of ideas already around either of these two things we're talking about as intersecting planes, experimental film and anthropology. Can we get, and I can't actually see you very well, so it'll be hard for me to call on people, but if you want to just use your voice and say, like, what is experimental film? Does anybody have ideas about what it is or what it's supposed to do? Or maybe one of my colleagues could call on people if they're... No, everybody's really being shy this morning. Are we a little nervous? Well, I'll tell you what I think, and then maybe you can tell me. It's a historic term to a certain degree, but in my practice, it's embracing chaos, reusing media. It's an alternative way of thinking about what media can do, and it's also a social practice, so people make things so that they can share them with each other. So experimental film for me is really, it can be narrative, it can be nonfiction, it can be totally abstract. It's the social context in which it's made that is actually the experiment. And it's an experiment that's been going on now for like 100 years, because experimental film emerged from extant artistic practices all over the world, not just in Western Europe, at different times, certainly, where artists who already were making art in other mediums embraced cinema as a medium and started to, transfer some of their ideas into this new form. So that's my definition. Maybe you'll share more or ask questions about that. How about anthropology? You should have this one down, right? Some ideas? What's anthropology? Go ahead.
The study of people and cultures.
Excellent. It is. I mean, that's the pretty standard definition. It's the study of people and cultures and how they reproduce their culture, not just by reproducing people, but by sharing it with each other and creating a continuing, community and culture that changes and grows. It is. I often say something when I talk to my students about anthropology, because my students are like, why anthropology? That's so weird, because they don't go to Evergreen, by the way. They say that. Why didn't you go to cinema studies or get a PhD in art history? I mean, those make more sense to them as related disciplines. And I say because people are really good to think with. And when you're trying to sort out, the question that I had about experimental cinema was how, I knew as a person how I practiced it and what I did, but as I started to look out in the world and interact with people, thinking about my community that I was based in and then these other communities and networks and strategies, I wanted to theorize that. And the only discipline at that time that that made sense to theorize that would be some using ethnographic methods, using anthropology, kind of sociology, to do it. I'll go to the next slide to talk about my origin narrative, why, and I have to trace it back to Evergreen. Evergreen was the place where people were open to embracing, moving, and this is, right, you're here, you know this already, this is the soup that you're swimming in, but interdisciplinary education. When I left here, it was a little bit like falling out of paradise, because you go out into the world and people expect disciplinarity. They expect you to pursue very sort of narrow concerns, and that was not how I was trained, and that's not who I wanted to be. So I have this slide up here. Does anybody know, and what these are stills from films, two very famous films, and I'm not sure what hall I was in. Could have been this one, I don't know. I'm not sure if it was Sally and Ann who showed it, or it was Lori, but these two films were shown in the same day in the class here at Evergreen. At Evergreen, where we are now. Anybody know what they are? On the left, you have a very famous, deeply problematic, but super interesting film called Axe Fight by Timothy Ash. It is, I think, 1974. Tim Ash, and I can't remember if Ann was here, she would be able to tell me who was recording sound on this. and were the cinematographer and there was a sound recordist, and it was based on the field work of a now relatively not popular and deeply problematic anthropologist, Napoleon Chagnon. Not my favorite human being. But the film, it's called Axe Fight, and what it is a study of a pretty short segment of live action footage, whatever, like things happening in front of the camera, in which the cinematographer can be heard and the sound recorders can be heard talking to each other, trying to figure out what's going on. So the first, it's a film in 4 parts, and the first part is just sort of what happened, right? The unedited footage, as much as, obviously, there is no such thing as unedited footage, right? Even as you are pointing the camera, if you do not turn it off, you're still editing because you're moving the camera where you're looking, right? There is no unmediated experience of reality, even reality itself. That's something I learned at Evergreen. In any event, so it's the unedited footage version. And you can hear the people saying, like, what's happening? Oh, it's a case of incest, or somebody hates somebody else, whatever. It's the chatter, the back chatter, which would never, at that point, 1974, you would never allow back chatter by the anthropologist and the technicians who are, the camera person, to be a part of it. But that's actually the first pass. And then the second pass is the anthropologist trying to figure out and actually, because it looks really chaotic. The first pass is totally almost illegible to the people in it, and then to the audience as well. It just looks very violent. We don't know why it's happening. We don't know what's changing, and etc. Then the second pass, they start to use these arrows and saying, Mao, I can't remember, it's Maui, is upset because somebody they kicked out of the village is back, and they brought all these people, and they're eating all the food, and so there was a fight in the garden, and so it's broken down in terms of psychological, sort of like what they thought was happening psychologically. The next pass is kinship charts. And it's all, you don't see the film at all, but they explain the relationships of all the people who are in, the protagonists, if you will, and why the problem exists based on kin and social relations. And then the last pass is sort of an edited, with the voice of God, explaining what's happening. 1974, completely revolutionary idea that this was what was required to understand or even get any sense of what was actually happening. And also it had this built-in sort of reflexivity that you had the technicians being like, I don't know what's going on. So it had this attempts at transparency and attempts at acknowledging how really they didn't know at all what was happening because they weren't a part of the culture that they were trying to observe. So fascinating film, deeply problematic in a lot of ways, shown by my professors here at Evergreen. And then, does anybody know the one on the right? Oh, come on. I'm pretty sure you showed it, Lori. This one's Serene Velocity by Ernie Gare. Yeah? Does anybody now, is that ringing any bells? It's like a structure, it's from this period of cinema that's called structural cinema, where most of the structural filmmakers were white dudes. It's a film that the filmmaker is in this hallway. It only takes place in this hallway. And the filmmaker is moving the focus and the length of the lens, so it's on a zoom lens, back and forth, and it goes like this. And it, like, as you watch it, it's and of course, now we watch everything on video and it doesn't really work, but if you project the film, as they did then back at Evergreen, they had projectors and they could project films, you would start to have this sort of hallucinatory effect, and it looked like the hall was coming out at you. And then the very, very end, these are doors, and at the very, very end, you start to see the light coming through the doors, and you realize that this was a film all taken in one night. in the basement of some building, and the lights and the sun comes up, and it's like this really, it's a film about how our eyes work. It's a film about how light works. It's a film about how cinema works, and it's also this sort of crazy, trippy experience. So my teachers here put those next to each other. So whatever I am, I started then. Because I thought came here thinking I would be some kind of artist, probably a painter, and Sally Cloninger came into my studio and she was like, ugh, you're making serial paintings, you're not a painter, you're a filmmaker. Come take my filmmaking class. And then Lori was so they really sort of brought to me this idea that, the world separates things into genres and categories, but that when we put things that are in totally disparate areas next to each other, we can start to see how they're working along similar concerns. And in putting these two things next to each other, we were really trying to think about, how, reality is, totally mediated through media, how we often don't know what's going on, how in one way, this film over here on the right is more of a document and more nonfiction than the one on the left. So, I don't know if I'm right, lefting, right, but whatever, you get the idea. So that's Evergreen. And what was interesting looking back and thinking about this trip and coming back to you after 30 years, is that I started to think about all the people who were in those classrooms with me who have gone on, some of them in very highly visible ways, as artists and as artist activists, really. And I was just so inspired. So I think that you are super duper lucky to be here at Evergreen and to have this kind of training. So the first film I want to show you, and then so you got to watch, pay attention, have questions. Because the first film I'm going to show, which I know you haven't seen yet, is a film called Endless Present, Biography of an Unknown Filmmaker, a film by Cornealius Thistle. I really like titles. And it's a film that was made just at the end of my Masters of Fine Arts program, as I was already beginning my PhD program in anthropology. So it's really a blend of these two disciplines or ideas or whatever. And it's also inspired by a film that I had seen as an MFA student and had completely just knocked my socks off, called Chronique d'un été, Chronicle of a Summer. It's by Jean Rouch. And again, a film that really sort of blends the ethnographic and the performative, asks really difficult questions, allows in a certain way the people that are being interviewed to really direct the action. Jean Rouch, another really problematic, as it happens, person, but the film itself was really transformative. So I'm going to leave you with that information, and I'm just going to mute this for a second because I have to find the film. Right on. There we go. Okay. So I have some questions that I was going to. I like it when I can see other people. Can we do that? Can we make it so thank you. Hello. That makes me feel less alone up here. Okay. So I have some questions, but I am open. These are my questions that I thought might be useful to get us talking about this, but I am totally open to your questions because I know, or I have been told, that you might have generated some questions for me based on the reading. So, since I didn't know that before I made this PowerPoint, we can start there. Does anybody have a question that they came to this today with that they'd like to share, or do they have something that just came to them while they were watching this piece that they'd like to ask? Like, how could you be so mean to all your friends and family? That's a good one. Because I'm a filmmaker. Just to be clear, the parents of the adolescents and then and the adolescents themselves, as well as everybody in the film, saw their edited interviews before I finished the film, which is really incredibly important to me as a filmmaker, ethically. Even Sasha, who I totally messed with. All right. Yeah, there? Yes? Hello?
So I'm interested in your connection of ethnography with experimental filmmaking. Would you say this piece is kind of an auto-ethnography of yourself rather than of others?
That's a great question. I do think that it is simultaneous. I mean, because I'm actually the subject of this film, right? And the things that I'm grappling with, and I'm using these other people to try and figure it out for myself. Some of them are really, really close friends. And there's a, but at the same time, it's also really pointing to to the unreality of it, to its constructedness. And it's trying to be really playful. So I was really happy that people were laughing at different points because I do have except for in my very bleakest pieces, which I will probably show tomorrow, at least one of them, there's some funny stuff where I'm making fun of myself, usually. But yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it is an autoethnography in a way, but using the people around me as a way to get to something I was interested in. Yes?
What made you decide to create a fictional filmmaker rather than just making it about yourself, obviously?
That's a really, but in the end, it is pretty obvious that it is kind of about me. So, I can tell you, one of the things that was a deep struggle for me embracing experimental cinema was how, despite the fact that I knew so many, like the people who turned me on to it were all women, or it was a very sort of almost, when you looked at its history and the way that it was written about, it was an almost impenetrable field of whiteness and maleness. So there was that kind of thinking about, it was hard to get work programmed in the 90s in experimental film festivals if you were female and didn't make work that looked like, that sort of, I call it high modernism. And so I was struggling with that, and I kind of wanted to loop that in a not obvious way. So I made myself into a character. It also helped me distance myself from some of the more painful, my dad is like, kind of, clearly we have a contentious, but we have a strange relationship, and a strained relationship, but I'm also like asking really hard questions, and he's answering them very honestly, which is very kind. He could have just said, go away. So I felt like I needed to turn myself into a character and also a caricature, kind of. And then the voice of God is reading my words, my narration, in this really sort of white male authoritative way. And there was something about splitting that up that I felt like I had to do for this piece. And there was a lot of reasons for it. Some of it was trying to point out to curators, the kind of, yeah. I don't know. I was also really, really fun to create this voice of God narrator, and also to create all these crazy, chaotic, bad documentary tropes, and to explore them. That was fun, and he's one of them. So that's part of why I did it. Bridget, hi.
Just as what you were talking about and thinking about the film, it makes me think about the idea of the artist and the model traditionally being a female and the artist being male.
Yeah.
And playing with those roles in this film, and having a male narrator, the voice of God, but when in fact you are the person who's behind the curtain.
Right. I'm my own muse. Isn't that fun? Yeah, no, it's totally true, and I am sort of playing with that as well. it's such a different, it's so great. I mean, I know that the world is still completely screwed up. And so even more so probably than it was at that particular moment. Although this came out directly after 9/11, which is kind of interesting. It was made before, came out in that moment. And maybe before, but it was in that moment, and people were like, "Ugh, how can you ask these questions? We're all terrified," which we were, and we still are, but whatever, for all kinds of reasons. But, sorry, I'm digressing. That idea of trying to make strange that relationship between artist and model, between muse and filmmaker, by treating myself as both, is something that actually another experimental filmmaker who's been deeply influential to me, Carolee Schneemann, sort of, I was thinking about her and the way that she foregrounds the use of her own body as, even though that's not me, don't take, like, at least in this moment, but like thinking about that and, and problematizing that. Yes. That's you. Yes, you.
So we were talking earlier about axe fight, and you were also mentioning like a desire to move into like archiving your works to preserve it for the future. Do you ever think about like how your work relates to like the changed perception over time of like films like axe fight? Like, did you foresee at some point in your life looking at this work and feeling upset, or like that your like discourse has like developed in such a way that it feels almost unrelatable to you? Like, it's kind of like can you do a projection looking back at the archive that you're just
Right.
now starting to form?
Right. That's an interesting question. It's kind of a two-parter, because in
I'm asking you to time travel.
right, yeah, you are. It's yeah. I can do that. I went to Evergreen. I can do that. So the first, there's a part of your question, I think, in the beginning, thinking about my relationship to visual ethnography or visual anthropology now. And it's an interesting and rather complicated relationship, because despite the fact that I wholly embrace and claim anthropology as foundational for myself, the field itself, anthropology as a field has changed radically, but visual anthropology still really struggles with this and a sort of not very reflexive adherence to realism. Like, pictures are what, which is crazy, because there's the people who are in that field are incredibly brilliant in so many other ways. So the place in anthropology where my work actually fits is this very fringe overlapping territory. And it's a lot more popular in Europe amongst European anthropologists for some reason, I don't know why, where they really push and pull at the discipline and question it quite a bit more in terms of art practice. In terms of US-based visual anthropology, I'm kind of present only because one of my mentors was such a major person in the field and my work was doing it, but it's not really seen as like within the mainstream of visual anthropology. That still continues to be relatively straightforward documentary types, observational type stuff. So I think that was the first part of your question. The other part is, will I look back and be embarrassed? Or feel like I don't know who that person was? Maybe if I start to have serious degeneration and my personality changes, and I don't recognize myself. I mean, that's possible. I've been with a parent through that process where they cease to know who they are and other people. But I see problems, sure, in the work that maybe when I was making it I didn't see, but I also see enough that continues to interest me. And I think the most important thing that I try to share with my own students, because I am a professor, is to own your mistakes and to be honest about how you have changed, and things you would do differently. And so, if I abandoned this work and said, I don't see it as being representative of me at all, then I wouldn't feel like that's not who I would be. I have work that's way more conventional. In fact, I have a piece, I think in the library here somewhere, probably, that I made while I was here. That's a much more conventional talking head documentary. I still look at that piece and I'm so proud, because thinking about the person I was when I made that, and it's like, I am who I am at the moment I'm being that, and you should never, not that you shouldn't second guess yourself and ask questions, but you also have to acknowledge that you have grown since that moment, I guess. That's what I'm saying. I'm archiving the work because it filmed, but of course archiving has this idea of it actually, that there's some sort of permanence. There's no permanence. I'm archiving electronic signals on a big drive on top of a big magnet called the Earth. That is, the minute an electronic signal is created, it begins to decay. Like, you got to embrace entropy. That's another thing I would say. Embrace entropy. Yes.
Will you be happy when you die?
I hope so. I think so. I mean, it's a funny thing. I was struggling a lot. I mean, a lot of my work is pretty funny, and I tend to present myself as a fairly lighthearted person, but I'll be honest, I struggle a lot with, self-doubt and depression, and even, dabble in suicidal thoughts. But, so there are times when it seems like death, like my father said, would be a relief. But when I think about like all the people in my life who I just adore and who make living worthwhile, and they include people that I haven't even met yet, my future students. I mean, I think about like to have had that life is pretty great. Like, so I think even if it all gets taken away from me, as I lose my capacity to move through the world and make a difference and be active, I think I'll still be able to reflect on knowing that I have actually, in the great scale of life, I've tried to add more good. And that's the objective. So hopefully I'll be happy when I die. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I cannot see up here.
No, it's okay, me neither. Do you think it would have, why did you make the decision to interview family and friends compared to, people you really didn't know? Because in the beginning I heard that you wanted to build this relationship between the person you interviewed and, the equipment you were using. And you think, because they kind of had that initial bias of, knowing you personally, there might have been, more focus on you rather than the equipment compared to interviewing a stranger who's I don't know who you are, what is this film that you're using?
That's a great question. So this film took place over, I started it and I mixed interviews between, I didn't do on the street work because I actually find on the street work deeply problematic. And we can talk about that. I really, even the images that are sort of observational from Philadelphia of sort of street scenes, I felt compelled after capturing them, right, the language of cinema. You take a shot, you capture an image. I felt compelled to be like, hey, I just filmed this. Would you, if you'd like to, I'm going to work on this, and I'm happy to be open at and is it okay if I use your image? And there were, as much, but it's hard because you're on the street and people walk by, and so that one. Yeah, whatever. And then the one where I'm actually at the crosswalk thing, I had a sign that said, I'm an experimental filmmaker making an experimental film. This scene might be in my movie. If you have a problem with that, please come talk to me. I tried. What? You know, it's like, but people didn't really give it, whatever, like we're just walking around Philadelphia. So anyhow, in the beginning, I tried arrange, but I had to know them. I didn't feel comfortable just walking up and asking someone I didn't know, because that's just not who I am. And but then as I started editing, and this goes back to something that you somewhere up there said, that I realized I really was making a film about myself. And so that arc of individuals kind of traced through ways that I remember thinking, like this little girl who I'm just like, Molly, she's so sweet. And, like how through your life, your idea, and then looking forward and anticipating who I might become, right? like so that arc of the people that I chose ended up being more me. Although in the end, there's a whole list of names and all those people were interviewed. And they had greater and less relationships with me, but this is the arc I chose. I still have all the stuff, and I kind of want to make a EP 2.0, like endless present, again, or something, or back to the endless present, or I don't know, because those other interviews are so compelling, and they were not, in a way, they didn't get included because they actually were they deserved their whole own subject. And that I couldn't fit it into this piece. So, but I don't interview random strangers. And I try not to film them either. That's why there's so many flowers and bugs in my movies. Like filming people makes me nervous. Not oh, I'm scared, but I don't want to violate I don't want to take something from you. Okay, so where are we in time-wise?
I have one more question.
Okay, sorry.
Could you just talk about the materiality of film in this piece, because it's so important, and the narrator talks about it, kind of summarizes that, and
Right.
the piece is just really funny.
Right, exactly.
It's also seriously there, right?
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is how the juxtaposition between the beautiful materiality, the disruption of the image, along with the sort of straight doc
Yeah.
format, and just if you could talk about why that materiality is important to you and to us while we're watching the film.
So, and I anticipate that there will be more questions about film as a medium, or why I use film as a medium, when we look at different pieces, because I use it differently in different ways. But at this particular moment in time, so I think of developing an artistic practice as a filmmaker just the same as I would have as a painter or a sculptor or a musician. You start to have the tools that you use and the techniques that you're experimenting with, and there's a way of falling in love with, there's when violinists talk about their violin, that's how I feel about my optical printer. It's this way of that relationship with the tools that you use being so they're an extension of your body, and you're just how you see the world and everything. And so this was when those techniques were beginning to be developed, where I was really diving into hand processing in a serious way. And there's a lot, so, probably Devin and a few other people in here are like, oh yeah, that was this sodium sulfide redeveloper. There are people who have watched this and have seen this and have come up to me and wanted to just talk about the chemical stuff, because that's part of their interests. So it couldn't not be there, because it's just I just loved it. And this is really when those techniques were starting to become fully folded into my practice. But also film is it's so magical, right? Because you can beat the crap out of it and it's still there. And to me, there's a corollary between us as human beings, for me, and film itself. it's just, it has this sense of like the skin. I often think about like as I'm manipulating film that has this sort of this body or this skin that I'm like, playing with. It's really physical, and light is physical. And there's a way for me it's a huge part of the passion that I bring to my work. And if you told me I couldn't do that anymore, it would be very hard. Like if I couldn't have that pleasurable experience with the materiality of the film itself, I would be very, very. I would probably have to go and start painting instead. Something I could do with my hands. I resist. I need. It's a physical piece. So one of the things that I explore a lot in here is, moving back and forth between sort of the reality and what for me is the really reality of film, if that makes sense. That was my hope. I was like, I'm going, and then, stuff happened. Ended up getting a PhD instead. I lost a bet. It's a funny story, yeah. But I do think I would encourage, like, the most interesting filmmakers that I know, if sometimes people really resist talking about their artistic practice as a practice and as something that's pleasurable because they think that it, like, art is somehow got a bad name for being like hedonistic or something. But the most interesting filmmakers I know, if you really get like, get down to it, they're actually really interested in something digital. And I'm talking people who use digital work too. One of a good friend, Evan Meany, he's a glitch artist, and we talk. It's so interesting. We talk about entropy all the time, even though his work is very digital. 2012, I'm not going to tell you too much about it, although that is a frame from it. It's a little bit shorter than the last one, and it's there's a film that I'm showing tomorrow that is from 2009 that's really investigating American expansionism during the 19th century and its impact on many things, but in this particular case on the countries of Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras. And also it's a film that plays with this idea of how media, particularly educational media, from a particular period in the mid-20th to late 20th century, represented these areas to, its audience in the United States. And it got me really thinking about my own role, if you will, and my family's role in expansionism and cultural and a genocide. Because I grew up in Washington State and can trace my lineage back to the mid-1800s. And despite there's a lot of people who, when we talk about these horrible, horrible legacies, the genocide of the indigenous population of the Americas, everything. You know what I'm talking about. That they say, but it's not my family's fault, or it's not my fault, because that all happened so long ago, I have no responsibility. So this piece, and then is in dialogue with a piece that came before it that I'm going to show tomorrow, and then I'm also going to show a new piece that's coming out that I'm going to show an excerpt of it tomorrow. But it's kind of like, what is our responsibility, or just how can we make visible the whatever privilege, whatever benefits, whatever legacy that we might have in relationship to particular topics. And so in this case, it's about the Oregon Trail, Oregon Territory, and my family's relationship to that. Another really up topic. And then also, yeah, well, I'll let you look at it, and then we'll talk about what you might think about that. It's only 20 minutes long. Okay, so now I have to figure out how to do what I do this. And then... I'm happy to entertain your questions or have some questions that I prepared as a jumping off point to talking about this. These are my questions. So, what might my work look like if I made it digitally? I don't know, because I would probably, I mean, one thing that you did say was that right, both of these films are really clearly trying to point to this idea that you are all really familiar with, that images are made. They are not, they might have some sort of referent to a real event or a real person or a real moment in time, but they're totally a representation. They're not real, except for in this fact that they are a representation. You know, and conventional documentary tries often, not always, but often tries to hide that, as does sometimes mainstream cinema, or not think about it, right? You know, reflectively in the work, the way in which it is a thing that is manufactured, right? And that's for a whole bunch of reasons. You know, maybe they just want to entertain you. So, like, they're like, don't think, just laugh, or cry, or whatever. You know, for me, I mean, maybe it's, I would really, really love it if it were no longer the case that I didn't have to remind viewers or my students or whatever that images are manufactured. You know, like all the things I just said. Someday maybe we'll be there. We're not there for sure yet. And there's a way of using cinematic tools, be they video or film, that tries to hide that I don't think is particularly useful, and is certainly nothing I'm interested in doing. That's part of it. The other part, and thus probably if I use digital, I would imagine I would foreground that in a way that makes sense for, you know, and digital is, right, you know, is big, right? There's a huge difference between my iPhone and a Red, or an Alexa, or, you know, like there's a huge, huge difference. And one of the things that I am, that's really important to me is to acknowledge my tools, to foreground my tools in the manufacturing of my work. And in this particular, and it happens differently in different pieces for different reasons. This piece is talking a lot about time, memory, responsibility, family, you know, like all these kinds of things. And that's why I use the particular tools that I do, time-lapse being one of them. There's two ways. There's the time-lapse, which is like speeding up, right? So taking a frame every 9 seconds or every minute or all these different things. And then there's the other way, which is where I'm doing this, I call it my Jonas Mekas cinematography, you know, or also, oh, what is her name? who I actually love even more, and why I can't remember. Go, go, go. Marie Menken. There we go. Sorry. Marie Menken. You know, they were two filmmakers who featured this really crazy handheld, jittery cinematographic style as an aspect of their work. And I use that I use that kind of as a distancing technique a little bit, but also as a way to, you know, like to kind of jittery, slow, jittery. You know, it's also a little bit of playing with the rhythm of cinema. But yeah, I mean, it's what I do. It's my thing, or one of my things. Other people may choose to make interventions in different ways. But I don't know what I'd be if I was a digital or someone who didn't use these particular tools. But it is, you know, I do think no matter what tool you use, I hope you really think about your tool and the way that it, you know, it's not just a transparent field, right? It absolutely imprints itself onto the images you make. And if you neglect to be aware of that as the maker, then you're leaving a lot of places where you could be impactful. You're leaving that out. And everybody's going to do it differently. There's a great piece, Strong Island. It's a documentary from a few years ago. Kind of a first-time genius filmmaker. I think it was their first piece, or one of their first pieces. But there's all these ways. So I would encourage you. It is a film made, you know, with digital tools, but the way those tools are used, the way interviews are used, the way sound is used, the way working under the camera is used is extraordinary, and absolutely points to the argument that's being made in the film. So you're not just learning about this great personal tragedy of the filmmakers, but you're also, like, the filmmaker is using the tools that they're using to, you know, to have you question the film, and also question reportage, question the stories that we've been told, because that's a big part of it, is questioning the stories that we've been told. Yes. Strong Island, and the filmmaker's name is, Google, please. Somebody? What? Alexa, can you tell us? It's been on Netflix. And they are also a Creative Capital awardee, so I feel like a product placement. That film was a Creative Capital film, is a Creative Capital film. So, but it's one of those pieces, because oftentimes my students will be like, yeah, digital sucks, man. I'm like, no. Tools, find that which, I am delighted when my students use their phones to make really good. I'm like, do it. You find it. Use what you have. Make use of it, and embrace the tools that make sense for you. That's my groove. I saw a hand somewhere over here. Yes.
In this work, it seems like there's like a huge margin of risk to be misinterpreted. In the methods of experimental film, I noticed that this would be hugely different with any sort of narration or like conversational interviews, because we saw like the document interviews with the photos being presented and the extreme close-ups on the hands. Like an interview, how do you cope with the like reality that you're probably often misinterpreted, and then like, what mechanisms do you use in your work to safeguard against that? Are you interested in safeguarding against that? That's my question.
That's a great question. I think I'm going to sound a little bit like a financial advisor here, but you really have to find the level of risk that you're comfortable with. Maybe that only works for people who are actually retired, like, thinking about retirement, but or eventually are trying to save for retirement. But that's something they always say, and I'm like, none, no risk. Let's take the money and put it under a rock. Like, I hate even whatever the financial whatever, but yeah, you can't help it. Remember that movie we just saw where there was like the little square and then and the communication and the noise in between and there's no way that that anybody's going to read anything that anyone makes. And when I say read, I'm using that in this really big way. So watch, absorb, interpret in exactly the way it was meant. Like there is no hope for that. So you need to embrace the reality that you may and you will have people see things in your work that aren't intended, miss things that are intended, and you just try to make work that is as true to your ethical standards and your ideas as you can. And I mean, one of the things, and if you come tomorrow, you'll see some work that I'm really grappling with that question with the piece that I'm working on right now, because I feel simultaneously incredibly responsible to be to tell a good, to convey some really important information. But simultaneously, I acknowledge that I might not be I'm certainly not the ideal person to tell it, but I'm the one who's telling the story because I have the power and the privilege of telling the story. So, if I have a huge amount of power and privilege compared to, the people who this process of migration have made invisible because they ceased to exist, because my ancestors, even though they were nice people, right, supposedly, came over and were a part of this wave of migration. So like I have the power and the privilege to actually make something about this, to try and poke at it and make people remember it. And to say, and by the way, I'm kind of, just by virtue of being an ancestor, is that right? Whatever, child of multiple generations of this, I have to take some responsibility for it. I don't know if you saw that in the piece, but that's what I intend, to be the idea that this piece is saying, I exist and all this other stuff is gone. And it also to engage with this idea of multiple layers of erasure, right? Because it's, like, my family is also, to a certain degree, erased, or my family's history was challenged and erased in this, because they weren't Christians. Oh well. Yes.
Technical question too, just in terms of, that's a 20-minute piece, could you talk a little bit about your process? Like, how much are you filming? Is there multiple cameras?
Yeah.
Your children have cameras? Like, how
Right.
long does it take to make something like this?
Forever. So this was an experiment. It's one thing to be, an artist and just like sort of out there doing your thing, and then you might be in a situation where all of a sudden you have dependent others who need you around, or need to be around you. Right, to literally, yes. That was happening to me as this piece was, as I was growing as a filmmaker, I was also creating a family, and part of being a filmmaker was figuring out the relationship of all of that to each other. And so for this piece, my kids were often with me, and I can't, so I put cameras in their hands because they wanted to hold cameras and they wanted to film things, and because that would make them a part of the thing. So anything that's small gauge in this film, so that's the regular 8, which has the 4 frames, and the Super 8 was shot by my eldest son, who was anywhere between 5 and 7 at the time. The film takes place over 2 different summers and took about 2 years. The only reason why it's not longer and there isn't more in it is that for a long time I really, really believed that I could only write short stories, be a short form filmmaker. And that is something that I'm pushing myself to change because, but also the West, what I know about her, there really isn't that much information about my great-great-grandmother, except for her, to call them journals would be an over stretch. Some of her kind of patient logs and reflections of, so kind of like a journal, but it was more like I set an arm, got 3 chickens in exchange for, taking a bullet out of somebody, it's kind of and laundry lists and whatever, and some of those notes are, whatever has survived is in the Oregon Historical Society. But you can't look at it, you can't touch it, you can't read it. It's like sealed in a, whatever, hermetically sealed something. So I could have made this bigger and longer, but the truth was, it's like, this is super distant history, and this is where we are in the present. So that's why it's 20 minutes. I initially thought it would be much bigger, but I didn't really know how to talk about that which I don't have any words nor images for. So yeah, that's, but it took a couple years, because I was busy with kids and stuff. Yes. Hi.
To what degree do you consider accessibility in your process of making?
Ooh, you mean like mobility accessibility or?
Content, and especially in reference to your study of avant-garde cinema, communities that while they have these alternative modes of commerce, be it giving and whatever, those are still insular to some degree, and the people within them have more access to understanding this type of cinema. And then when I think about accessibility, I'm thinking about people who don't study film.
Mm-hmm.
Their experience with film is just visual cinema, and so
if they're lucky.
is your work not for them? And to what degree do you think
Right.
about that accessibility is what I mean?
Well, I think that it is a shame that all kinds of work that is non-commercial isn't more accessible. The only reason why commercial cinema is more accessible is because it's more prevalent. I refuse to believe that, unfortunately, we've done a really great job of taking media literacy and even critical thinking skills out of our public education, free public education. So we've done a really good job of that over the past 50 years, whereas before that. So I feel like there's a way of people thinking that they can engage with things that aren't what they see on TV, but I don't believe it. I'm perfectly happy to be told that, anybody who comes to a piece, and I have, my work shows it all over the place. It doesn't just show in the black box or the white box. It actually shows in community centers and different things. And, anybody who comes to watching it with an open heart is this is what I see. This is the story I told to myself in my mind while that was happening. And it's wow, cool, great. But I do think that there's a way of, the way that we use media in the United States right now makes people think that they can't engage with stuff that isn't what they're used to. And that's a bummer, because they can. It's like telling people that you can't appreciate sculpture because you weren't trained to go, but it's you can appreciate anything. You might not like it. You might think this is crap, or you might not think this is crap, but you might think this is I don't like this, but that doesn't mean that you didn't engage with it. So there's a way, I believe, there is a way of making people think that non-mainstream cinema is elitist, and some people are like that, but I'm totally willing to have my work show anywhere. And in terms of accessibility, thus I have, despite the fact that it's not my way, put it up on Vimeo, and like when people want to look at it, I will give them access for free, and I don't, I don't, like if people find me and want to talk to me, I am very accessible, and I'm willing to make my work accessible. But that's not, you're absolutely right, that's not all experimental filmmakers, and I can't speak for all experimental filmmakers, because I'm not. But most of the people I know are like that. Because I don't hang out with the snobby folks. They're not my people. And to be fair, that's not how I was brought, like, that's not the filmmaking tradition that I'm a part of. And it's to a certain degree what my work pushes back against. Yes?
How much do you feel like your work is, like, so you call yourself, so you're like an experimental filmmaker. How much do you think the experimental part comes from the editing, or the filmmaking, or the storytelling? Or is it about the audience reaction, since you're kind of
That's a great question. I have no idea. I think, my work is like, well, there's different pieces are different, actually. Some work is really, really constructed, like Endless Present was basically almost completely reshot on an optical printer, except for the interview segments. So it really was like that's the editing phase if you're going by the conventional, like, sort of breakdown of industrial commercial practice. But my work, I tend to be shooting and editing constantly on all sorts of things. So I think of it as being in the studio, like a painter, or, and I'm always in that mode. And so, like, the hardest part is to know when a piece is done. And I think for me, when a piece is done is when I just can't do it anymore. Like when it's like excruciatingly painful to work on it anymore, because it's just, I have nothing else to say. And that's when a piece is done. So I don't know, that was an opaque and not very useful answer, but the truth is that there's no separation between any of those activities. I almost never write scripts. In the conventional or even the unconventional sense.
Do you tend to document, like, how people react to your experimental films as a way of observing others?
I have done reception studies before. They're extremely tedious, and it's hard to do clean. And what I mean by that is unbiased and untainted reception studies of something like this. So no, because it's hard work and I don't want to do it. I have other things to do. Sorry, that was a little, but it's true. I mean, I'd rather, that's why I guess I'm a bad anthropologist, because like that hard, painstaking work that kind of work is not of interest to me. Any other? Oh, okay, I can't see. That's the problem. So you have to shout.
Hey, I just had a quick question when you're with the intertitles, and you had the pencil in hand. It seemed there was one of those scenes where suddenly there was a screwdriver at the bottom of is that what that was?
Yeah, there's a screwdriver, and there's like, I was trying to get the page to lay down. Talk about using what you have in hand. That's, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your sound work, because I found in this piece it was really strong, and especially the explosions and the fireworks sequence, and how that played into the theme of the film. I just wondered if you could talk about
Sure.
to the sound.
Yeah. Sound. So I am hearing impaired in my left ear. I try to tell people that, so because sometimes people think I'm ignoring them, and I'm like, nope, you just done my bad ear. Sound is a struggle for me, and I struggle a lot with giving it the care and attention that I give the image, because my work is sonic and visual, like I want it to be. So, but sound is harder for me. So for this piece, and I struggle with it in a whole bunch of different ways in every piece. This piece, I did a lot of ambient recording in the locations that I was in, and did a pretty good job of keeping track of that information to start to match back some of the sounds with the images, not like they're sync at all, because if I would have been recording sound when the time-lapse was happening, you would have heard the time-lapse motor, which you actually do hear in places when I'm writing. I recorded some of the time-lapse motor. I wanted that to be in there. It's very subtle. Only a few people would even realize that that's what they're hearing when they hear that. I wanted to get really strong, good stereo recordings of things like the fireworks. I find fireworks are one of those things. They're super beautiful, and they signify something deeply horrible. And so it's like, it's this just sort of, I wanted that. I really wanted that to be this sort of like, moment of, where that kind of comes home, or maybe comes home to the audience, what that signifies. And people are like, yay! I have this really, really, really strong memory of in fact, I was here at Evergreen when we invaded Iraq. It was the Kuwait War, Iraq, and the commentator being like, hey, wow, look at that, it's like the 4th of July. As we're bombing Baghdad. And it's like, the horror. Like, I mean, I never could look at fireworks problematically, because I had a father with severe PTSD who would hide in closets during, you met him, he was in the film, actually. Both of them. So I could never look at them innocently, but at the same time, they are really beautiful. So it's this, like, I wanted that. So the sound is actually what carries that. Because once the fireworks visually are done, it then goes over all these other scenes. And you start to hear the sun's going down, and there's this, this whistle, like a bomb is about to, and it's just like, like, for me at least, I wanted to build sonic tension. So that's what's happening. The whistle blowing of the tea kettle, like I put it on during one of the scenes when I'm talking about the past, and then when we get to the KFC, that's when it goes off, and it's like, yeah. So this little thing that you did in 1845, look what happened. Like, this is the result. So it's for me, the sound in this piece at least really works in concert, and then to kind of support the story sonically, like maybe at least that's how I'm trying to do it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, good. But sound is hard. Yes.
Going off that same topic, did you record the woman giving birth sound, or did you find that out?
Excellent question. Somebody thought a reviewer reviewed my film and thought it was me giving birth, and I was like, no. Sorry, I'm a little busy when I'm giving birth. It's from a movie. Yeah. It's from a movie that I collect found footage, and so tomorrow you'll see a lot of films that use a lot of found footage, and for a whole bunch of reasons, but that I use found footage. But that I had a film of a woman giving birth. And I was like, this sound is great, just the way it is. I'm just going to use this. So I do a lot of use of found material in my work, and found audio. I'm trying to think if there's any other. The whole boo 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 boo. That's also found audio from a like a western, like some B western. that I had. Also, because it's like the horror, right? You know, we would watch those, or some of us would watch them and maybe be entertained, maybe not be entertained, maybe be bored, whatever, but then you're like in these places thinking about how that was represented in media, fed to children. And it's a history that's, you know, obviously telling a really false narrative. Yeah. Anyhow, so there I am though with my kid, and that's why my kid is in it. That's I think one of my questions. Oh, why do I make my kids a part of it? You're parenting. Better be careful what you do because your kids grow up and they become people who move through the world, and I'm super conscious of that. And so trying to think about how to both inform my child about this relationship to this history that our family has, and make them also someone who's going to move through the world in a way that that I can respect, and that I can that they will, on balance, do more good than bad. So that's why my kids are in it. I was going to ask you that question, but I just answered it. And yeah, I mean, it's totally possible to make this movie and make it not with my family in it at all, but that wouldn't be me, that would be someone else. Yes, did you? Okay. Yes.
I don't know if there's a question in here, but I just wanted to talk about something I appreciated about this film. And that, I think it's when you were talking about, it made me realize this when you were talking about the kind of Jonas Mekas, Marie Menken signature style,
Right.
kind of skittery camera work. And I was thinking about how when you drew my attention to that kind of after the film, I was thinking about the way that it is like handwriting. It has kind of like a scribbling effect, and I was thinking about the way that it then resonates with you, kind of handwriting.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And I was thinking also just about the beautiful footage of your child painting, like just kind of in the backyard painting, and then that classic kind of home movie shot of holding up the painting. And I was thinking about the language of home movies in the piece and the way that it's really poignant. And I think making a film about this, and you're talking about kind of, it's a history that you feel really compelled, like it's important to grapple with and do something with, but what to do with it in the absence of so much material. And I guess I love the way that it felt like I was just thinking through something with you. And it had this really non-monumental feeling, like I'm not trying to say something grand, but I'm here grappling with and trying to be in the middle of it, in the midst of being with my kids in the yard. And I had the sense of kind of like living a life and as a kind of a regular person, and that this kind of thinking through something is a part of a regular person's life.
Right.
It's not something that, the grand filmmaker gets to get up on the box and say. Which I just appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I do think that comes back to this idea of like, a film doesn't have to say something enormous or be super, that's that idea that we all have to make, I don't know, Citizen Kane every time we walk, whatever you feel about that film, it's like, no, that's not, film should be able to be little and personal and distracted and silly and humble and maybe goofy and maybe put your foot in your mouth, you should be able to do all of this stuff. Film should be as human as we are, in other words, and, at least that's my perspective.
I think it's easy to forget that because of the role that it plays in our culture.
Right.
It's not like a drawing. Like, if somebody does drawing, they're an artist and they say, my medium is drawing.
Right.
The drawing is by its nature, it can disappear, it's intimate, it's
ephemeral.
It's ephemeral, right? And I think I like always seeing when someone is working with film in a way that seems to be borrowing languages from other mediums to kind of, again,
right.
like exactly, kind of pose that implicit kind of question is, does it, it costs a lot more than drawing, and I think, like, oh my God, I've got to stay my thing, because, you know, I was thinking about the slow motion shot in here of the fountain, and I was like, cha-ching, 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 because you burn up so much film
Yeah.
shooting slow motion. So I know that feeling of, oh my God, this is so expensive, and it takes so much time to make. But to be able to risk saying, and I'm going to draw with my camera, and I'm going to think about it that way,
Yeah.
it's important.
I think it's important, though, to people often, I mean, film itself, right, raw stock can be expensive. It can also be really, really inexpensive in the sense that people give it away all the time. It's really, somebody left some in a refrigerator or a freezer, or it's outdated and nobody wants it anymore. And so a lot of my work is made incredibly inexpensively because of that, because I use outdated stock all the time. I do a lot of hand processing, so I'm not using a lab. And I'm, part of a collective that we've started to, I mean, I have a lot of my own tools, but I'm part of a collective that shares tools so that, because, how much does a new iPhone cost, or a digital DSLR, and then the MacBook, you have to get a new one every 3 years and buy I've had my Bolex that, by the way, I got free, not because I traded my labor for it, so it wasn't free, but money was not exchanged, and I've had it since right after I graduated from here, so for 30 years. And I've only had to send it back to the mothership once and it cost me like $500. And, I mean, it's just like this idea that film is so expensive is, I think, really manufactured by people who would like to keep y'all out of it. Even if you don't have a camera. I mean, I'm actually going to teach a workshop tomorrow on cameraless film. So film made without a camera, just with film. So, I mean, and Devin certainly does that all the time. It's like, you could take, people have been turning media, like film, throwing it away, deaccessioning. You grab that, you bleach it, then it becomes a place for you to make your own film right back on top of it with drawing. I mean, there's so much good trash, and that's part of it too. It doesn't. I mean, I could never have afforded to make the films that I've made if I had to have purchased digital gear to do it. But because I had my own rewinds and I had my own camera, I was able to. Does that make sense? So I pushed back against this, the idea that that film is elitist and impossible and super expensive, more so than digital, because I think digital is actually truly that. And also, by the way, ruining our environment by this constant built-in obsolescence. But that's just my thing. It's also the reason why my book is, my book is actually also a real push to recycle media, because we've made so much of it. We ought to make something new out of this old stuff that was made, instead of just throw it in the middle of the ocean. Closing. Oh, is it time? All right. Well, does anybody, I mean, what do you want to know? I could endlessly share until I passed out from fatigue. But, I do think that, it's funny because when I was younger, I used to think that I had to be an artist like a particular artist. Like, I like Carolee Schneemann, so that means I have to take off my clothes and carve on my stomach, right? And I did make a film like that while I was here at Evergreen. Yeah, like blood. I need to make a film with blood, nudity. And as I got older, Bridget's like, that's right. As I got older, I became the filmmaker that I am, using the skills that I have, and as it turns out, I'm actually not so much into filming my own nudity now. So somebody had asked, like, are there things you look back and I'm like, no, it's not that I'm ashamed of it. I'm just like, that maybe was me trying to be a different artist than I actually am. So I think it's really important to find, like, the artist who you are, like what you really want to say, what you absolutely care about, and the tools that best fit those things. As opposed to, I'm going to start with a tool and then figure out what to do. It's like, from my perspective, that's the wrong direction. And also, like, in terms of story or whatever, again, what are you really trying to say? What are you really trying to communicate? And then find a mode to communicate it and a way to do it that actually fits that thing. As opposed to, well, I'm making a documentary, so that means I need to have talking head and B-roll. Well, maybe if you want to show it on PBS, but actually even PBS is more experimental than that now. So, I think that it's really super crucial to actually figure out what it is that you have to say before you figure out how it is that you're going to try and say it. Or sort of simultaneously, like that can happen too, but and what tools you feel comfortable with, and you should feel free to experiment. I always, draw a little, throw some clay around, like you have and this is Sally Cloninger, you have no idea until you find it that it's yours. So you shouldn't just be like, well, my friend said, or my teacher said. It's like, you need to really find out what you think. So that's it. And also, despite the fact that the world is a fairly difficult place right now, I think that there's a lot of reasons to keep making work. If only to survive for another day. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.